having a series of messages entitled I Will. It's based on a book Tom Rainer wrote by that same title. Tom is a minister. He is a consultant for churches, and they find ways to help them reach their fullest potential. And not always I think the idea of church growth is taboo in some people's circles. He doesn't go in it from the aspect of just simply church to help people and congregations reach their fullest potentials. And having said that, sometimes we find ourselves in a conundrum. How do we be the local church that we love and we appreciate and that we like, and we're with the people who are like us, and yet still be the church that God intended? Because sometimes the two don't mesh. Have you figured that one out? My dear brother in Christ, he's like a father in the faith to me, Brother Ben Merrill, 90 years old almost this year, and still preaching some. He's not as much. He's still ministering to ministers. He's a preacher's preacher. I posted a little message he preached from the North American Christian Convention back in 2014 to Facebook, my page this past week. I ran across it, and I forgot he had preached that message, and it's just so in-depth for the church today, how God intends the church to be everything he intends it to be. And he addresses in that message four groups. And so he talks about mega churches. He says, God love you. We appreciate what you're doing. Keep it up. Reach people. Do all you can. Along the way, don't forget about the smaller churches. Be a resource for those smaller congregations. Help them be everything God intended them to be. And he goes through and he addresses different groups, and he gets to small churches. And he says, and you small churches, God bless you. Keep doing what you're doing. But he said, here's the thing about small churches. He says they're in little churches, as he would say. He said, you're little. He said, you have little enemies and you have little friends because you do little. And sometimes we do that, don't we? We don't get us so involved. And how is that? Because we as individuals have to be everything God intended us to be. Now, I'm going to address the topic today that we don't like. I mean, it's just something we don't like to talk about. As I mentioned before, we can go to Walmart and we can see a teddy bear for $9.99. We can see one for $19.99. We can see one for $29. We can see one for $49. We can see one for $89. We don't have a problem with that. We can just say, depending on how much I love Amy today, or how bad I've messed up, maybe another thing, man. How much do I need to spend on this thing? But when it comes to our relationship and with Christ and who we are and how we're ministering to the world around us through our love and response to Jesus, when we talk about giving, that's a challenge for us. I had a lady in my previous congregation where every time I could just bring up giving. I didn't have to preach a message on giving. I'd always get a note at the end of church service. She would hand me a little note written. She kept a notepad just so she could write me a note. And rarely were there ever good notes about, I really appreciate that message. That was a great message. It really touched my heart. It was always with, you preached on so-and-so today, and you just don't understand. And that's where it always started, where some of us or some people may have struggled with this or struggled with that. And so one day I sat down with her, and I told her, well, the reason I preached on it is because some people have a struggle with this and a struggle with that. Now, I'm not going to talk about her today. You may tire of me talking about this lady. She was such a sweet, loving, and kind and selfless lady. The only problem I had with her is I wish I had met her earlier in life. I wish God had put us in a position where we could have known her way before we ever did. She had this infectious smile, the cutest little walk, a little tiny lady. She took these little short steps when she walked. Looked like she was running everywhere she went, but she weren't going anywhere. But she was one of the most generous people I've ever met in my life, and God just really blessed me to get to know her as a lady with deep conviction. She loved the Lord, and everybody knew it. You didn't have to worry about that. You could bring up her name in the community with anybody that you'd meet, and they could have a terrible day, and you could bring this lady's name up, and their whole countenance would change. They would just melt just thinking about her, and a smile would have to come to their face. She loved the Lord. She didn't just say it; she lived it, and it wasn't just something that she kept to herself. I mean, she let everybody know it. She didn't feel like her relationship with Jesus was something for her alone. She felt everybody should have it, like Jimmy was mentioning with his lesson with the little kids. And let's face it, I mean, we all have something in our life that we just can be a little stingy with. And we just want it all to ourselves. You ever said this thing, I just want a little me time. I just need a little me time. I just need me. Or have you ever said, well, I think I deserve so-and-so. I get ready to go buy something. And after all, I don't ever do much for myself. Maybe I think I deserve something. But that wasn't Lois. She just loved, she loved to be a non-selfish individual. God had not ever intended for her to be that. From my first meeting with her, I knew I liked her. And it wasn't because she was trying to give me something. It was just because of the type of person she was. She didn't just go around and hand you a little something and say, now remember me, I'm the person who gave you something. And it wasn't long before I realized I would quickly fall in love with her. Now, my wife could hear this message today, and if I had never given you a name, she would say, well, he's talking about me. Well, she's very much like her. Now, she don't quite take them little short steps yet, walking. But if there was someone who genuinely cared about the Lord and His church, it was Lois Hedgepeth. From the youngest of the young, when they walked through the door, when Trey met her when he was 5 years old, and she reached up and she hugged him and she patted him on the head. And you have to know Trey, at that age, he would look at her and say, what's she touched me for? And now he's the lover. He wants to hug everybody. And where did he get some of that? He got it from people like Lois. I just understand that God puts things and people in your life. And it was from the youngest of the young to the most senior member. She just loved them. And she gave of herself and her material blessings to anyone that she felt was in need. And now you don't believe me. If she was alive today, all you would have to do is just take a walk through her house and just see the eclectic collection of items that were around it. I mean, look, there was moccasins. And there was dream catchers, and there was these made in China throws that show up in her mailbox, delivered to her house, and they would be free. But then they would say, but any donation would be appreciated. And she felt like since somebody gave her something, that she wanted to give them something. She was just that way, generous. And so she had throws and ink pens and puzzles and shirts. She had metal plaques. And I think she mentioned that prisoners, she thought, made them. Because after all, here's that word. She said, I heard that's where they make license plates. And at any rate, the Lord knows. And He's the only one who really counts. So she'd send them money for them. Little spiritual sayings, things on it. And, all she knew was that someone sent her something and she wanted to do something kind in return. Now, with all that said, no one, and I mean no one, was the benefactor of her generosity as much as the Lord's church. I mean, she gave generously to her own church, and I was fortunate to be the minister of that congregation, and I understand that she loved and supported the church generously with her gifts. But there were several other congregations, is what I found out upon her sickness, and as she was getting ready, the Lord to take her home, who she also gave to them generously on a regular basis. Every month, she would write generous checks to these local congregations, and whether they've been to church her family, her mom went to, or her father had grown up in, or whatever the case was, or she had nieces and nephews in churches. So much so that some of them even sent her their annual financial statements along with a pledge card for the coming year. Now, this was a generous person. Now, why do I talk about her so much? It's because when I need a visual or a picture of a word, and words such as generosity comes to mind, I see Lois Hedgepeth. God allows people like that in your life. And I was honored to know her for a few years, and like I said, my only regret was I didn't know her longer, and then I was asked to preach her funeral. Now, you've been to funerals of people who are in their 80s, pushing 90 years old, and typically the attendance in those services are going to be somewhat modest, aren't they? I mean, after all, most of their friends and family, they've gone on themselves, and there's only so many left, or maybe they're not able to get out and go. I mean, maybe those folks who are closest to them, maybe to the point where they're homebound or in a nursing home or whatever the case is, but not Lois's service. No, I think it was quite possibly the largest funeral that I've been blessed to share in to date. Standing room only, deacons' benches, they used to call them in the church, full choir loft full of just people. They wouldn't know where to sit, so we put them all up in the choir loft around behind the church. They would stand along the walls. They were out in the vestibule. The door was open to the church. They were on the front porch. And Lois was this type of person, never had any children. And she says, when I die, preacher, y'all come together, you have a meal. And you go to Fellowship Hall, have a meal, and whatever time y'all see fit, you come up and just preach a good sermon. Don't talk about me. And it was like homecoming. All right? And she said, because I don't have no family. I never had any children. I hardly have any family. There's not going to be many people there. I know the church will be there and all. And it was the largest service I ever preached at that church. And probably the largest funeral I've ever preached. And now I told you that because as I stood there and I preached, I talked about Lois. And I talked about how she had this love for the Lord. Preachers need some points to talk about people. So I said she had a love for her Lord. She had a love for her family and those who were extended family. Most everybody in the community called her Aunt Lois. She weren't their aunt. They just called her Aunt Lois. And then I said, but she also had this love for showing generosity, and it didn't have to be somebody she knew. She was just understood that God wanted her to be a blessing. And when I said that, when I brought that point out, that's when the whole place began to murmur. They were just people talking. And it was husbands and wives leaning over and talking, saying, you remember when Lois did so-and-so? It was a parent leaning down to a child, saying, you remember when we told you how Aunt Lois, when we were going through a tough time, Aunt Lois showed up and she did. And it was just story after story people were sharing with one another during the service about Lois's generosity. And I would love to say it stopped there, but it was weeks on end after that people would see me out in the community. They would come and say, let me tell you this about, you preached Lois's funeral, and I was there. And I just want to tell you about what she did about this time or that thing. Now, I want to say, well, how does she know all these people were going through what they were going through? Because she had an intimate relationship with Jesus. She prayed about him. She prayed about God just opened doors. And I love her. I love my favorite line about her. She'd always say this. She says, I don't have much, but what little bit I got, I love it. God, I told God I would share it with people. That's what she always said. I don't have much. And she said, I told God, if you'll just open up me to be the type of person you want me to be, I'll bless those who you want me to bless. And so that brings us to the main meat of the message, and we're going to breeze through it, okay? First of all, it's based on the greatest sermon that was ever preached. You find it in the Scripture. And the crowds come and surround Jesus. It's based in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. We're going to get you in parts of chapter 6 and 7 briefly. There it is. We see Jesus. He has this crowd of people. They're gathering around him. It's known as the Sermon on the Mount. And Matthew records these words about how the people responded when Jesus finished his preaching. I'm going to start you at the end of the message. All right, here's what it says in verses 28 and 29 in Matthew chapter 7. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. Now, the subject he covers along the way, they're kind of pointed and convicting. You have to believe it. They're near the halfway point in his message. He turns the topic to money. We try to do everything we can to avoid it, and yet he turns it to it. And you can almost imagine the crowd's discomfort, probably much like some of you are today, because the preacher's going to talk about giving and money, you know. And here's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. He says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, these are powerful words for the first century church, aren't they? People are going through persecution and they're poor and they don't have a whole lot. But let me say, they're just as powerful for the 21st century church. Jesus says that we're not only not to focus on collecting material wealth. However, he is not advocating we don't save, okay? Don't go and say, well, I'm going to go out today and buy that $90 teddy bear for Valentine's Day because I'm not supposed to be saving any money. Jesus says don't store up. That's what he's getting at. He's not advocating not saving. What he's getting at is not focusing on only holding on to the material things in life. Watch where your focus in life really is. Rainer would say these words. He's focusing on the heart issue of money. If we're not to collect, then the obvious corollary is that we are to give. You can save. You can put away for retirement. We all need a little something for an emergency or rainy day. That's just prudent, okay? It's when we don't think we can even eat. I heard stories yesterday morning as we met with the men for prayer breakfast, and we were eating breakfast, and I think Kim shared the story about a man that he once knew. He said he would order 2 eggs, and he would order one scrambled and the other one fried, so he made sure he got 2 eggs. You see? B.J. Ott shared a story about a man that he knew that would order a double cheeseburger. And he would take one of the patties off and put it between 2 slices of bread and make it full so you could have a second one later. He'd eat one then and eat one later. I mean, we can be prudent, we can be frugal, okay? But when all we do is focus on those things, we're missing the picture, big picture. Here's what Jesus offers, the most powerful punch of this part of the message. He talks about our treasures. He says, where your treasure is, in Matthew 6:21, there your heart will be also. And you, like me, have probably heard preachers say things like, you can tell more about a person from his checkbook than anything else. You look at where people spend their money, and we find out that it reflects their heart and their priorities. And maybe you're like me, when you think about it, you even cringe when you hear it. But you know what it is about it? It's true. It's right. I've had to deal with it personally in my own life. Sometimes when I'm wondering where my relationship with Jesus is, and somebody sends me an appeal for some missions or whatever the case is, well, I just don't have, John Brown, I'm giving all I can right now to everything I can. I just don't. And I had to go back and then I look in my checkbook. And I see how many times maybe we've gone out to eat or what we spent our money on. I'm like, well, I do have $10 a month. You see what I'm getting at? So we have to understand where our heart and our priorities are. You see, you're in luck. Jesus doesn't stop there. When he gets to talking about that. Rayner will say these words. Jesus says, you're either going to have him as your Lord or you're going to have your money. So here's what Rayner would say. If you're obsessed with your money, he's not your Lord. If you're focused on your money instead of Jesus, he's not your Lord. If you're not generous with your money, he's not your Lord. Now, we recognize that you say, well, maybe the preacher, they just say, give all my money to the church. God's laid some people and some missions and ministries on your heart that maybe he's challenged you with, not only giving your tithes to the local church, but all other opportunities to bless people. Show your love of Christ for those around you. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear statements like that, I kind of take an issue with it. I know me. After all, I think I'm pretty generous. I've already kind of touched on that. I give to the church. I give to people who are getting a tough spot from time to time. I don't buy a lot of stuff for myself. I go shopping. Look, I wear the same suits I bought 10 years ago. I carry them to the cleaners, get them clean. I got about 4 or 5 suits I wear over and over again. You say, boy, I'll really be glad when he gets a new suit. I've seen that one enough. I go shopping with intentions to do so at times, and then I get there and I say something like, well, I tell myself, well, you can really do without that. You don't really need that right now, or maybe it'll be on sale later. And then I even tell myself, after all, I work pretty hard for my money. If I don't have to have it, why buy it? And maybe it sounds familiar for you. But it's that last thing I tell myself that challenges my own heart as I think about it. When I was writing the message and I wrote this thing down, I said, I've been convicted here. Here's what Jesus told the people on the mountainside in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. He says, no one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. But you can't serve both God and money. And when we try to tiptoe around the issue of money, we make it an uncomfortable topic for people to discuss. Now look, here's another one we don't talk about much in church. Sex. Why? It's uncomfortable. Why? It's a natural thing that takes place, but we don't talk about it because it's uncomfortable. And we've almost made money the same way. We don't discuss it. My business is my business, and you don't belong in my business. That's the way we look at it. But what we're dealing with, as Jesus would say, is we're dealing with a heart issue. It's just that simple. And if we're not cheerfully generous with the funds that God blesses us with, regardless if I can give at the level you give or not, if I can't give it in a cheerful way, I'm not obediently following Jesus in my giving. But what happened? That was one of the most powerful sermon that was ever given. It deals with the shift in the local congregation. Church leaders and researchers say it's hard to pinpoint the exact time, but they think somewhere in the 70s, the early 80s, money and stewardship became a delicate topic. I mean, even old TV shows from the 70s, like Sanford & Son, they begin to talk about different televangelists and stuff like, you know, and the things that they were asking for money on TV. And so some leaders just feared that mentioning money in the worship service is going to drive guests away. So you're visiting today, you say, well, see, I come to a church. The reason I'll never go to church is because they talk about money. You're in luck because I'm talking about money today, but we don't want to drive you away. We're talking about people who have a relationship with Jesus who understand that there's my giving is part of my relationship with him, just like I provide and I give to my family that I'm in a relationship with. Well, maybe so. If you say, well, you're just responding to legalistic demands for giving to the congregation. Some people just overreact. You know, you just overreact, the subject shouldn't even get brought up so often. And you know, why even talk about it? Well, Rainer would say these words. It seems the greatest shift took place in the attitude of the number of church members. You ever heard a church member withholding their funds because they didn't like something in the church? Others giving were celebrated by their designating what the church would spend their money on when they give it to them. They write a check for their tithe, but then they write in the corner where it should go. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with giving to a dedicated ministry within the church and being passionate about something that you know God would have you do. You want to give money to a building fund or whatever the case may be. Nothing wrong with that. But when I write on my check every Sunday, if I were to write, well, what I'm really worried about is the church building. And so I'm going to write on mine designated lights, water, gas, whatever the case is. What I would really be saying at that point then is I don't really trust God to do the right thing with the money I'm giving him. After all, I work hard for my money, and I want to make sure it goes where it's supposed to go. You see, when we do such things, as Rainer would state, we've developed a consumer mindset of giving versus just, here's what Jesus desires. You read book of Acts, and you go to Acts chapter 5, as the church was struggling, it says the people went out and everybody gave. They just all had all things in common. And when they run out of money, they went out and sold their personal belongings so that nobody went without anything, and they cared for one another. Then you read the negative side of that thing when you see Ananias and Sapphira going out selling a piece of property, and what happened? They come in, lied, said, this is every bit of the money, but they kept back part of it for themselves. So we have to stop and say, if I'm going to have these things in common with other believers, I don't need to have a consumer mindset on giving. And even though I may not understand the need or even personally agree with where the giving goes, I still trust God in my giving. That brings us to probably the most powerful part of the message, the cheerful part. You know, the cheerful factor. Paul was writing to the church at Corinth and about giving, and the church was a troubled congregation, to say the least, and they had a lot of different issues. But here he gets specific on this one topic. And he tells them that their spiritual growth is going to be directly tied in their relationship to their generous giving. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6, it says this, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. He's left no doubt on the matter. He's not beating around the bush in any way. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people say, well, I just can't give, but God knows my heart. To that I say, he sure does. And then he also knew the heart of the widow in Luke chapter 21 who gave her money. And as they watched her give, everybody else is coming along, and they're laying their offering in the plate, clanging cymbals, and they're making a big, having a trumpet blown or making a big to-do. This lady walks up, and she just only has 2 small copper coins, and she drops them in the plate. And when Jesus sees it, and he tells those who are with him, he says, you know, look at these people. They're doing it all for show. But this woman gave everything she had. He knew her heart too. She only had a little bit to give, and Jesus he said, therefore she's given more than all the rest. And what was true for the church then is true for the church today. You see, Paul doesn't even stop there in verse 6. He goes on verse 7. He says, each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves this cheerful giver. First, he tells them about the motivations that they should have and not in their giving. Shouldn't do it reluctantly. If they're trying to hold on to something that they know they should be giving, that's reluctant giving. Even though I know it belongs to God. I've already said I was going to do this. But if what if I just held on to it for a little longer? I can make it up later. You see, you're reluctant and you're giving. And he says, don't do it reluctantly. He encourages them to give willfully. Secondly, we shouldn't give with a motivation of legalism. In other words, Paul would put it this way, out of necessity, compulsion. I got to do it. It's just an expectation. Rayner says this: we do not give to please a person or set of guidelines. We give to please God. And in doing so, we find our greatest joy in giving. Those who give out of legalistic obligations will soon resent those guidelines. You've ever hadn't given a handbook at work and they tell you how you can dress and how you can talk and what time you can eat and everything, and they're for a reason. They make the company function a certain way but after a while you begin to resent that you signed the handbook. How dare they? What's wrong with what I'm dressed in today? Why can't I go to eat lunch 5 minutes early and come back 5 minutes later? You see, we struggle. But Paul addresses the positive motive here for giving. He lays it out. Our biggest challenge, he says, it should be cheerful. That Greek word cheerful is the same word we get our word hilarious from. Now, there's been times I've had to come to offering plate comes and I get looking at what I got to give and I don't want to bust out laughing. This is all I got to give. This is what they're going to laugh me out of this place today, But it's the same word we get our word hilarious from. That's what the word. Only time it's used in the Bible is right there in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7. And it connotes overflowing giving, joyous giving, hilarious giving. In other words, you're excited about it. In other words, giving should be one of the greatest joys that we could have in our life. So you need some action plan to follow it through briefly. Here's some steps. Make it a matter of prayer. Here's what Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7. Each person should do as they've decided in their heart. How do you know what you decided in your heart? You got to ask God. You got to talk to him about it. You got to understand, Lord, what are you leading me to do? When Amy and I decided that we were going to begin to be tithers in the local church, we did it off our net income. This was years and years and years ago. Kelsey's a little girl, 4 years old, 20 years ago. And we decided that we were going to, we just for whatever reason, we both felt convicted. We hadn't talked about it or anything. And all of a sudden one day, it's a Saturday, we're sitting down, we're going through, I've made our deposit on Friday, we're going through what we needed to pay, our bills and everything, and we're looking, and then all of a sudden as we're sitting and having the conversation, we both said at the same time, I've been thinking about tithing. And so we looked at what we had. We understood that if we gave what we had, we wouldn't have enough for gas and necessities for the following week. We hadn't planned. And then I said, well, we'll talk about it and pray about it when I come back in. And the reason I said that, the mail had run. And I said, let me run out to the mailbox. The lady come by. She toots the horn when she comes, so we run out. I went and got the mail, and sure enough, back then, my insurance company, we paid where we went to the doctor, and then they reimbursed us our part that they paid, their 80%. And we opened the check. I said, well, it was a check back from the insurance company where Kelsey had went to the doctor. And it was within just a couple of cents to be in exactly what it would have been if we tithe off our income. We didn't have to worry about what does God want us to do. We were questioning, how would he want us to do? Because he's expecting us to do it, he's now providing. All right, you wanted to do it, but the timing of it all, we were talking about tithing. We just got through saying, we can't afford to do this. There's no way it would work this week. Maybe another week it might, but not this week. And then, beep, beep, little mail truck, Jeep comes through, toots the horn, puts the stuff in there, go out, and there it is. God said, if you got a desire, It's on your heart. You're being convicted of it. Now watch me provide for it. That brings me to the second part, the second action point here. Understand that the God that we serve is not a God of limited means. We base all of our giving off of when we look at what we have. Remember the lady I briefly touched on at the beginning of the service? She would always write me a little letter. You don't understand. Everybody can't do this. Everybody can't do that. I live on a fixed income. And so finally one day I said, so do I. So do I. Your fixed income's one thing. My fixed income's something else. You don't have to worry about giving off my fixed income. I don't have to worry about giving off your fixed income. All I have to do is go off what God has given me. That's all he desires from me. Don't go off of thinking about what you've been limited by man for. Think about the God who can give and bless and do. I don't have time to go into the testimony we have about how God provided for us while we went through college. And often we approach stewardship from our limited perspective. And what we need to do is look at what we do have, and even in those areas of places where we don't have the faith to say, when God here says, just trust me. Just trust me. Finally, just do it. Just give. God give without hesitation. That's what God designed you to do. He wants total dependence on him. And when we begin to do that, watch God fulfill his promises. Watch him fulfill his promises. Don't do it with reservation. Watch God take care of everything else as you go along. I think our joy as believers in Christ is closely tied to our giving. I've learned that. Now, it's taken me a while to get there. But our joy as believers in Christ is closely tied to the way that we share and the way we do and the way we intertwine our life because of what Jesus has done. I respond to his church in this way. I want other people to know. I want other people to know. You see, the sad truth is, statistically, it's always been, just like with the work, 80% of the people don't do. 80% of the people don't tithe on a regular basis. They give, but they don't tithe. 20% of the people tithe on a regular basis. 20% of the people in the congregation are going to be actively ministering in the congregation. But why do they do that? They do it for the other 80% because they want you to have the same relationship that they have with Jesus. So maybe you want to shift your focus. Be willing to give. Do it cheerfully. And find where joy really lies. To do that, you need to know Jesus. You need to have a relationship with Jesus. You can't give to something you don't fully understand. It's like going to Walmart. Remember we talked about that? I can't walk in and buy a $90 teddy bear and pick somebody random off the street and say, you need to be my Valentine. I'm going to go get something like that because of somebody I'm already in a relationship with or I want to have a relationship with. And here's where you stand today. Do you want a relationship with Jesus? Do you have a relationship with Jesus? And if not, will you respond to this invitation as we stand and sing? Here's where we go. Stand up, please. Life that we have some challenges. We get too focused on the material and that we lose sight of Jesus. And we fail to realize that the material in our life is the direct result of your blessing our life. And we take credit for it, how hard we worked or how thrifty we've been in saving that we've accumulated. or whatever the case may be. We steal your glory. Can we just say it for what it really is? So today, God, I pray as we've looked into your word, that you challenge us in our area of giving, regardless if we are a faithful, long-time giver and steward in the church and a tither. You just remind us of why we do what we do. Help us to recapture if we've lost the joy in giving. And help us not to get fallen into guideline rituals, but also, Lord, to understand that as we pour our heart into this, you pour your heart into us. And then, Lord, motivate the rest of us that if we are here today and we're just a casual giver, remind us in our heart that as we only give $1 a week, we couldn't live, we couldn't sustain ourselves on $52 a year. And so why would we think that the church would be able to do that as well? We recognize, God, each person has been gifted in various ways materially. Some have very little, and they give generously out of that. Some have been given great blessings, and they give generously. And then we have those on both ends who just feel like that they need to protect themselves. God, let us trust you. Let us trust you for provision, and let us trust you for everything we need in a way that people know we have a complete dependence on you. In Christ's name, amen.